"This night I don't want to sleep alone in the cold," said the chained Apache woman. And in that moment, the cowboy rescued her from the slave traders. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The cattle trail town was nearly shut for the night. Doors closed early when the air turned sharp, and only the saloon kept its lamps burning steady. Out back, behind the gambling hall, a pen had been thrown together in the dirt yard. Its boards were rough cut and nailed crooked, rope tied through gaps to keep it from falling apart. It wasn't meant for livestock, not tonight. Men were chained inside, wrists drawn together, ankles clamped, their faces set hard or turned away in shame. Among them was the Apache woman. Her name was not spoken here. She had been marched 2 days, her arms bound, her feet cracked from walking barefoot on stone. Her dress, once whole, had been pulled and torn at the seams. Leather gaped across her chest, the rip showing the line of her cleavage. The hem was split where it had been yanked, bearing more of her thighs than she ever wanted shown. She pulled herself small against the post, shivering. She had lived through raids, through hunger, through flight, but this, the sound of white men laughing while she sat chained in the cold, made her feel both rage and dread. She thought of her family left behind. She thought of how many times she had fought to survive, and now her body was being measured like a horse. She hated that her shoulders trembled. She hated that her lips cracked in the cold when she tried to stay silent. But silence only made the traders bolder, so finally she spoke. "This night, I don't want to sleep alone in the cold." The words weren't meant to plead. They slipped out sharp, half broken by her own breath. The men around the pen caught them anyway. One slapped another on the back, laughing. "Hear that? She's got a request." Their jeers rolled together, louder than the sound of chains. Her stomach knotted, her chest pulled tight, and she kept her eyes down. Better not to give them anything more. From the shadows at the edge of the yard, another man watched. He stood with his back against the wall of the livery, arms folded across his chest. His coat was long, dust-stained, the brim of his hat pulled low. He was broad-shouldered, tall, built from years of ranch work and hard living. His name was Eli Mercer, though no one in town called him anything but the cowboy when they bothered to notice him at all. Eli had not come to the gambling hall for drink or for company. He had come for supplies left at the livery, flour, nails, oil for his lamp. He lived 2 days' ride north, alone, in a cabin that had once been built for a family. His wife and child had died of fever 5 years back, and since then he had lived with silence and work as his only companions. He kept to himself, spoke to no one unless he had to. Nights like this, he avoided the saloon and went about his errands without looking at anyone. But tonight he stopped. He hadn't meant to linger, hadn't meant to look. When he heard her voice, though thin, ragged, yet edged with defiance, it cut straight through the cold. He felt his chest tighten, the way it had tightened the night his wife had begged him to keep their baby alive when the fever worsened. He had failed then. Now he stood here again, listening to another voice asking not to be left alone, his jaw clenched. He hated the sight of her dress torn, her body shown off by accident, the traders making jokes as if she were less than human. He felt the anger heat slow and heavy in his chest, and with it, a decision formed. He had no business stepping into it. He knew what kind of trouble it brought to buy a person out of chains, what kind of trouble it brought to stand against men who thrived on cruelty. He told himself to walk away, to collect his flour and his oil, and return to his cabin where silence waited. But his boots stayed planted. His hand hovered near his revolver, his pale eyes fixed on the woman who had spoken. The Apache woman did not see him yet. She was staring at the dirt under her feet, her wrists aching where the shackles dug in. She thought of how cold the night would be, how close those men would press if they chose. She wondered if she would survive it, if she would see another dawn outside of chains. She whispered to herself, quiet, low, that she would not cry, not in front of them, and still she shivered. Eli straightened from the wall. He adjusted the brim of his hat. His decision was made. Though the thought of what it would cost him pressed hard in his chest, he stepped from the shadows toward the pen, boots crunching on the frozen dirt, the traders turning at the sound. The night had changed course. The traders straightened when they saw Eli step from the shadows, his boots slow and steady against the packed dirt. He stopped just short of the pen, pale eyes fixed on the Apache woman. She looked up at him briefly, then dropped her gaze again, uncertain if he was another man come to mock or to bargain. Her stomach tightened. She had seen men like him before, weathered, broad, carrying silence like a weapon. She braced herself for the worst. The dealer, a squat man with greasy hair under a bowler hat, puffed out his chest. "Looking for company, cowboy?" He gestured with his thumb toward the chain figures. "Got plenty to choose from. This one here." He pointed directly at her, the gesture sharp and cruel. "She's strong, fiery, won't last long without a man to keep her." Eli's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. His silence unsettled the men more than anger would have. They shifted, waiting, eyes flicking between his holstered revolver and his steady stare. The woman's heart pounded. She hated that they used words like company, hated the way their eyes skimmed her torn dress. She wished she had the strength to spit at them, but her throat was dry, her body drained. All she could do was sit straighter, refusing to look broken. Still, the question burned in her mind. Was this stranger just another buyer? Another man who would take her body as his prize? Eli reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He let it fall into his hand, coins clinking heavy in the cold. He sat on the rail of the pen. "She comes with me," he said, voice flat, low, leaving no room for argument. The dealer laughed nervously. "Now hold on." Eli's hand shifted to his hip. He didn't draw, only rested his palm against the revolver, his thumb brushing the hammer. The traders froze. The dealer swallowed, eyes darting to the others for support, but no one stepped forward. The silence grew heavy, the only sound the rattle of chains as the Apache woman turned her head slightly to watch. Finally, the dealer spat into the dirt and grabbed the pouch. "She's yours. Take her, and don't bring her back." His voice was sour, but his hands moved quick, fumbling for the K-E-Y as the lock snapped open. The Apache woman's breath caught. The iron slid from her wrists, leaving raw bruises dark against her bronze skin. She rubbed them instinctively, wincing. For a moment, she almost didn't move, as if her body didn't believe freedom was real. Eli stepped closer, extending a hand. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to distrust, to stay away, to fight if she had to. It's something in his eyes, steady, not prying, made her reach out. Her fingers trembled as they touched his. He pulled her gently to her feet. She swayed, her legs weak from days of walking and cold nights on the ground. Her body leaned against his chest for balance. She could feel the coarse fabric of his coat, smell the faint leather and smoke clinging to him. For a second, fears surged that he might take advantage now that she was in his hands. But he only steadied her, then stepped back enough to let her breathe. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. His voice surprised her. It was not harsh, not mocking. Plain words, serious, meant to know if she had strength. She nodded, though her legs still shook. The men behind the fence muttered, disappointed that no fight had come. Some were angry at the easy way Eli had taken her, others wary of his calm threat. None followed when he led her past them, his hand firm on her arm, guiding but not gripping. Outside the yard, his horse waited tied to a post. He untied the reins, checked the saddle, then lifted her up in one smooth motion. She gasped, clutching the pommel, the shift of the torn dress pulling across her thighs and chest. She looked down at him, half expecting him to leer. He didn't. He only adjusted the stirrup and mounted behind her. The weight of his arm came around her waist to hold her steady. She stiffened at first, every muscle on edge. But his grip didn't tighten beyond what was needed to keep her from falling. She felt his silence as much as his touch. No demands, no cruelty, just the steady control of a man guiding a horse into the dark. As they rode out of town, she looked back once. The pen was already fading into shadow, the men shrinking into the glow of lanterns. She thought of what they would say, how they would laugh once the cowboy was gone. But she wasn't there anymore. That Eli's jaw remained hard as they rode. He thought of the coins he had spent, the trouble he had just bought for himself. He didn't need anyone at his cabin. He had lived 5 years without company, without a voice but his own. He told himself this was a mistake. But he remembered the sound of her words, "I don't want to sleep alone in the cold," and knew he couldn't have turned away. She leaned slightly against him as the horse carried them north, her body weak, her mind racing with fear and questions. Who was this man? Why had he chosen her? Was she free now? Or had she only traded one prison for another? Neither spoke. The night swallowed their questions, leaving only the rhythm of hooves and the cold air cutting their faces as they rode toward the hills. The ride north stretched long and silent. The trail wound through brush and rock, the moon pulling thin light across the ground. The Apache woman sat stiff in the saddle, her hands gripping leather, her body tense beneath the weight of his arm holding her steady. Every sound made her flinch, the bark of a coyote, the snap of a branch under the horse's hooves. She had been led on trails before, always under threat, always into worse places. She could not yet believe this one would end differently. Eli felt her stiffness, the way she pressed herself small against him as though she were ready to leap away if given half a chance. He didn't blame her. He knew what she had endured even without asking. He remembered the look of the trader's eyes when they pointed her out, remembered how the crowd laughed at her torn dress. The thought made his jaw grind. He kept the horse moving steady, the reins loose in his hands, saying nothing because he had never been good with words. That be why the time the cabin came into view, the sky had begun to pale. Smoke rose faint from the chimney. He had banked the stove before leaving 2 days back, and the embers had held. The place looked as it always did. Rough-hewn logs, roof patched in 3 different places, a door that leaned if not latched properly. To her eyes, it was nothing short of strange. She had expected another camp, another pen, another place to wait for men to decide her fate. Instead, there was a cabin set against the hills, small but standing, the fence line half mended, a shed leaning to one side. He dismounted first, boots hitting the dirt. Then he turned, his hands steady as he lifted her down. She stumbled, her legs weak, and his arm caught her waist again. She stiffened at his touch, but he let go the instant she was steady, not keeping her longer than necessary. That detail unsettled her. She had grown used to men who clutched too long, who took more than what was given. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, with a faint iron tang of tools left on the workbench. A cot sat against one wall, while blanket folded rough. A table with 2 chairs stood near the stove, and shelves of jars lined one corner. Flour, beans, coffee, salt. It was more than she expected a man alone would keep. She hesitated at the threshold, her bare feet raw against the plank floor. The place felt foreign, but not cruel. She didn't move until he gestured quietly toward the cot. "There," he said, voice low and even. She walked to it slowly, lowering herself onto the edge. Clutching the blanket when he set it across her shoulders, he busied himself at the stove, adding wood, stirring the embers until fire caught. He set a kettle on the top, then filled a tin cup with water from a bucket and placed it on the table. He left bread beside it, hard but clean. She watched him move, trying to understand his silence. He did not ask her name. He did not tell her his. He did not look at her torn dress the way the others had. She wanted to ask why. Why he had pulled her out of chains, why he had spent his coin when he could have walked away. But her throat tightened. She feared the answer might be one she couldn't bear. So she stayed quiet, staring at the bruises on her wrists, rubbing them until the skin burned. Eli turned finally, leaning against the table, arms crossed. He studied her carefully. He knew what questions would sit in her mind. Was she free, or had she only been traded to him? What did he expect from her now that she was under his roof? He wanted to answer without her having to ask. "You're safe here," he said. The words felt stiff in his mouth, but he forced them. "No one will come for you." Her eyes lifted, sharp, trying to read him. She searched for the lie, for the demand beneath the words. She found none. Only a man whose face carried grief he had not spoken aloud. She nodded once. Though her body stayed rigid, the kettle began to whistle. He poured hot water into the tin cup, setting it back in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, letting the steam warm her fingers. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, her body eased a fraction. He turned away again, giving her space, checking the latch on the door, laying his coat across the back of a chair. He did not touch her, did not press her with questions, and though suspicion still gnawed at her, some small corner of her chest loosened. She was not in the pen. She was not in chains. She was not cold under the eyes of laughing men. That night, she lay on the cot wrapped in the wool blanket, the sound of wind scraping the shutters. Eli sat by the stove, chair tilted back, revolver resting on the table within reach. He kept his watch without speaking, pale eyes drifting once to the cot where she had finally closed her eyes. And though she slept light, jerking at every creak of the cabin, when dawn came, she had not been touched, not been moved, not been taken. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she had been allowed to simply sleep. Morning light crept into the cabin through the thin cracks in the shutters. The Apache woman stirred first, the wool blanket heavy across her body, her eyes blinking against the dim light. For a moment, confusion pulled at her. She wasn't outside. She wasn't in a pen. No chains cut into her wrists. She pushed herself upright slowly, muscles aching from days of strain. Across the room, the cowboy sat at the table, boots planted, his revolver in easy reach. He had not slept. The hollows under his pale eyes gave him away. He was used to long nights, but part of him had kept vigil for her sake too. He wasn't sure she would try to run, if fear would push her into the dark before he could explain himself. She studied him, the silence stretching. A question formed in her mind, the same one that had pressed at her since he bought her. Why had he done it? Why her? He sensed the unspoken weight in her stare. He shifted slightly, cleared his throat, and spoke for the first time that morning. You'll want food. He gestured toward a small loaf of bread left on the table. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. She hesitated. The bread sat between them like a test. She wondered if taking it meant something, meant she belonged to him now, meant she owed. But hunger gnawed sharper than suspicion. She took it, tearing a small piece and chewing slow. He noticed the way her hands shook as she held it, the way her bruised wrists turned pale against the crust. He had seen men return from war camps with the same look, half-starved, half expecting someone to snatch food from them before they swallowed. He forced his gaze down to the table, not wanting to make her feel like she was still being watched. When the meal was done, Eli stood, pulling on his coat. About work outside. Wood to cut. Fences to mend. You stay warm in here. He started toward the door, but when he glanced back, she was already moving, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her bare feet touched the plank floor with hesitation. I can help, she said, her voice rough but steady. He paused. The sight of her, tired, bruised, dress torn so it barely covered her, made him want to refuse. You need rest, he answered, but she shook her head, eyes flashing. She couldn't stand the thought of lying useless in another man's space, waiting for whatever came. She had been treated like a burden too long. Work, even small, was survival. He saw in her eyes that, he gave a short nod and stepped aside. Outside, the air was cold but clear, the sky pale with early sun. He handed her an armful of kindling already split, lighter than the logs he would carry. She staggered at first, and used the weight after days in chains, but tightened her grip and carried it inside to stack beside the stove. When she returned, he was swinging the axe, each strike sharp and controlled. His shoulders moved with practiced rhythm, the blade biting deep into the wood. She paused to watch, noticing how steady his movements were, how he wasted no effort. When he glanced up and caught her watching, she quickly bent to gather another load of kindling. He said nothing, only nodded slightly, approving her help without words. By the time the sun had climbed higher, she had made several trips, her breathing rough, sweat dampening her hairline. He wanted to tell her to stop, but he understood. Her labor was not for him. It was for herself, to prove she was not useless. Later, he repaired a section of fence that had sagged in the last storm. She carried nails from the pouch at his side, holding them out when he needed one. Their hands brushed once, just briefly, and both of them froze. Her pulse leapt at the contact, but he only shifted back, hammering the nail in with deliberate focus. He knew if he startled her, if he showed any sign of hunger like the men she had been trapped among, she would bolt by afternoon. Her body ached, but there was a different light in her face. She had stacked wood, carried water, even wiped the dust from the table inside. She had moved through his cabin and yard not as a prisoner, but as someone who belonged to the routine. That mattered more than words. Still, questions burned in her chest. She set the last piece of wood by the stove, then turned to him. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her, not pretending to misunderstand. "Why did you take me from them?" His jaw clenched, and for a moment he said nothing. He thought of the grave behind his cabin, the small wooden cross, the memory of fever that had taken his wife and child. He thought of how he had stood frozen years ago when their voices had begged him to do something he could not. Finally, he gave the only truth he could manage. "Because I couldn't leave you there." She held his gaze for a long moment. There was no demand in his answer, no promise either, only a blunt truth. And though suspicion still pricked at her, something inside her eased. For the first time, she believed he might not want to own her. He might only want her safe. That night, as the fire burned warm and steady, she curled in the cot again with the wool blanket pulled high. He sat by the stove, sharpening a knife, his pale eyes lifting once to check on her. She watched him until sleep took her, her body worn, but her mind a little less afraid. The cabin was no longer silent with grief alone. It had begun to carry the sound of two lives instead of one. The evening settled cold again, the kind of cold that pressed through the cracks of the cabin walls, though the fire inside did its best to push it back. The Apache woman sat on the cot with the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair loose down her back, her hands tight around the cup he had given her. Eli sat across the room at the table, cleaning his revolver in steady motions, each click of metal carrying through the silence. She had worked all day beside him, carrying kindling, hauling water, standing near while he mended the fence. Her body ached now, but it was the ache of use, not of chains. She thought about that difference, how strange it felt to have tired muscles from choice rather than from being dragged. Still, questions burned inside her chest. Why had he not asked her name? Why had he not spoken about what he expected from her now? She wondered if he was holding back, waiting for her to drop her guard before demanding something she could not refuse. Eli knew she was watching him even when her eyes dropped to the floor. He felt the weight of her suspicion and didn't blame her. Men had treated her as less than human. He had seen it with his own eyes in the trader's yard. He wanted to tell her she owed him nothing, but he knew words weren't enough. He had to prove it by staying steady, by never crossing a line. His silence was deliberate. He believed actions carried further than talk. The fire cracked and shifted. She tightened the blanket around herself, but still shivered. Finally, she stood, her bare feet light on the planks. She hesitated halfway between the cot and the table, her chest rising and falling quickly. "Not alone," she said softly, the words breaking the quiet. "Not tonight." Eli's eyes lifted from the revolver. His jaw tightened as old grief pressed against him. The last time someone had asked him for warmth, for presence, it had been his wife in the final weeks of fever. He had held her, helpless, unable to keep her alive. The memory cut him, but he forced himself to stay in the present. He saw the woman before him, her torn dress slipping across her chest, her eyes dark with fear but also with stubborn strength. And he understood. She wasn't offering herself. She was asking for safety, for proof that she wouldn't wake chained again. He pushed the revolver aside and nodded once. He shifted his chair back from the table and gestured to the space near the fire. She came forward slowly, each step measured as though ready to turn back. When she lowered herself onto the rug before the stove, the blanket slid from one shoulder, showing more of her bruised skin. She waited, testing to see what he would do. Eli stood, crossed the room, and without a word placed his long coat over her shoulders to cover what the blanket hadn't. He sat back down beside the stove, a careful distance between them, his hands resting on his knees, her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. She leaned against the chair leg near him, the blanket and coat layered over her body, the fire warming her face. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the tension in her chest loosened. Her heart still beat fast, but the fear that had lived there like a knife began to dull. He watched her eyes grow heavy, her head tipping slightly as the heat worked into her. When she finally gave in and leaned against his leg, he stayed still, not moving except to shift his hand slowly to rest over hers. His touch was light, steady, carrying no demand. She let out a long, shaking breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. In that moment, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she believed she might not just be passing from one captor to another. She might actually be safe. Eli kept his eyes on the fire, his hand firm over hers. He didn't need to speak to know the promise had been made. She wasn't alone anymore, and though sleep came uneasy, filled with half-dreams of laughter and chains, she didn't wake screaming. She woke with his coat still around her shoulders, the fire still burning, and his presence still steady beside her. For both of them, it was the first night that felt less haunted. The following morning brought clearer skies and a hard frost over the ground. The Apache woman stepped outside, wrapped in his wool blanket, her breath rising white in the air. The cabin yard looked different in daylight. A shed leaned against the fence line. The corral sagged where rails had split, and piles of lumber sat half-cut near the chopping block. She realized then how much work this man carried alone. Her eyes went back to him as he hauled a bucket of water from the creek, his shoulders broad beneath the worn duster, his movement steady but heavy, like a man who had carried too much for too long. Inside, she helped grind coffee beans on the small mill he kept, awkward at first, her hands stiff. He watched her without comment, then showed her how to turn the handle smoother, slower. She picked it up quickly, her brow furrowed as she concentrated, determined not to appear useless. When the kettle whistled, he poured 2 cups, sliding one toward her. It was the first time he had shared something with her, as though she were equal, not just a mouth to feed. She noticed that detail, tucked it away silently. By midday, he had set her to small tasks inside while he mended tack outside. She cut strips of cloth for kindling, sorted nails from a tin, and patched a rip in one of his shirts with thread he had left behind from his wife. She hesitated when she touched the fabric, wondering who the woman had been, if he thought of her still, if she was meant to replace her. The thought tightened her chest, but she stitched anyway, her work careful. When he came in later, sweat on his brow from labor, he found her with the shirt folded neat on the table. He paused, the sight of it stirring something deep. He hadn't worn that shirt since before the fever, hadn't thought he ever would again. His throat tightened, but he only gave a small nod. She caught the flicker of pain in his eyes and understood then why his silence carried such weight. As the evening came, she knelt by the stove, brushing ash into a pan, her hair falling loose across her face. Eli stepped forward to hand her the tin cup of water. Their hands touched, not in passing this time, but lingering, her fingers cool, his calloused and warm. She froze, her breath catching, her chest rising sharply under the torn dress. He didn't pull away, and for a long moment, neither did she, her eyes lifted to his. They were close enough that she could see the lines carved deep at the corners, the pale blue worn by years under the sun, the grief he carried like another scar. She felt her pulse hammer against her throat. She feared what it meant. Feared if she let this happen, she would belong to him the way men had always claimed women. But something in his gaze told her otherwise. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't demand. It was restraint, care, and something she hadn't known in a long time. Choice that he bent slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. His lips brushed hers, light, almost questioning. She didn't move at first, then leaned forward just enough to close the space. The kiss was brief, trembling, but it shifted the ground beneath both of them. Her hand rose to his chest, feeling the rough fabric of his shirt, the steady thump of his heart underneath. His hand hovered at her waist, steadying but not pulling, showing her that he wouldn't take more than she allowed. When they parted, she looked down quickly, her cheeks burning. She pulled the blanket tighter, uncertain if she had made a mistake. He didn't push, didn't speak. He simply sat back in the chair near the fire, his jaw tight, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. That night, she chose not to return to the cot immediately. Instead, she sat on the floor near the fire where he had sharpened his knife the night before. She leaned against the chair leg again, closer this time, not testing, but deciding. He draped his coat over her shoulders without a word, then rested his hand lightly over hers when she reached up for him. For the first time since chains had been locked on her wrists, she felt she was not just surviving, but beginning to live again. And for Eli, the silence that had filled his cabin for 5 years no longer felt like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something he thought he would never have again. The days after their first kiss passed with a strange calm. The Apache woman began to move through the cabin as though testing the edges of belonging. She tended the fire without being asked, stacked wood with a steadier arm, even tried to sweep the dust from the corners of the floor with a bundle of sagebrush she had gathered near the creek. Eli worked alongside her, silent as always, but his silence carried less weight now. At night, she sat closer to him by the fire, no longer stiff with fear, and he allowed himself small glances when she laughed softly at the hens scratching in the yard. But in towns like these, nothing stayed hidden. Traders didn't forget when a man walked off with what they claimed as property. Word spread quickly, and by the end of the week, trouble came riding to it was late afternoon when Eli spotted the dust cloud first, 3 riders cresting the ridge south of the cabin. He set down the axe he had been swinging and narrowed his pale eyes. The Apache woman followed his gaze, her chest tightening. Her first thought was that the traders had come back, and her body froze. She remembered their laughter, the way their hands had pulled at her dress, the cold weight of chains. Fear rose sharp in her throat, but when she looked at Eli, she saw no panic. He simply stood straighter, shoulders squared, his revolver at his hip. The riders pulled up hard in the yard, their horses blowing steam. 2 of them were the same men from the pen in town, their faces mean with drink and spite. The third was new, broader, with a scar across his cheek. He was the one who spoke. "You got something belongs to us," he called out, his eyes sliding past Eli to the woman standing in the doorway. "We're here to take her back." Eli's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, boots crunching the dirt. "She's not yours," he said flatly. The scarred man sneered. "She ain't yours either. You think a handful of coins makes her free? You're just another buyer, same as us." The woman gripped the edge of the doorframe, her heart pounding. She wanted to shout that she wasn't anyone's, that she chose to stay, but her voice caught in her throat. She feared that speaking would only make them laugh again. Instead, she clenched her fists at her sides, nails biting her palms, and stayed where she was that Eli's hand moved slowly to rest on the butt of his revolver. "She's under my roof. That's all that matters." His tone was low, steady, the kind that made men think twice. The 2 traders shifted uneasily in their saddles. They remembered his eyes from that night in town, remembered the weight of his silence. But the scar man was not so easily swayed. He spat into the dirt. "You gonna fight 3 men over a squaw?" The word struck her like a blow, but Eli didn't flinch. His pale eyes stayed fixed, unblinking. "I'll fight as many as I have to." The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun. The air thickened. The woman's breath came fast, her chest rising and falling under the torn dress. She thought of running, of hiding in the shed, but something inside her rebelled against the idea of cowering again. She stepped out of the doorway and stood behind Eli, her hand brushing lightly against the back of his coat. He didn't turn, but he felt her presence steady him. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Eli spoke, his voice like a drawn line. "Last chance. Turn around." The scarred man's jaw worked, his eyes flicking to the woman, then back to Eli. He weighed the odds, the steadiness of Eli's hand, the sharpness in his gaze. Finally, with a curse, he jerked his reins. The horses wheeled, hooves kicking up dust, and the 3 men rode back the way they came, their anger trailing with them. Silence fell heavy when the sound of hooves faded. Eli let his hand drop from the revolver. He turned slowly toward her. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned steady. She had not hidden. She had stood behind him, choosing not to let fear own her. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, his voice rougher than he meant. Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that the danger was over. But deep down, she knew men like that didn't give up so easy. Still, she stepped closer, placing her hand flat against his chest, feeling the slow beat of his heart under her palm. For the first time, she let herself say it aloud, even if only in a whisper meant for him alone. "I'll stay." Eli covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his chest, his pale eyes softening. In that moment, it wasn't just a promise of protection he offered. It was the beginning of belonging for both of them. The days after the riders left brought a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, haunted quiet that had clung to the cabin before she came, but a watchful one, filled with the knowledge that danger might still return. The Apache woman stayed close to the cabin for the first few mornings, stepping outside only when Eli was near. She scanned the tree line often, listening for hooves, waiting for the sound of voices calling her back into chains. When none came, her shoulders began to ease, and slowly, her steps carried more purpose. Inside, she set herself to tasks she had once done in her people's camps. She swept dust from the corners with a bundle of brush, washed the tin cups with water hauled from the creek, and mended what she could. Eli noticed how her eyes searched the shelves, lingering on the jars of beans and flour, the folded shirts left from his wife's time. She asked no questions about the woman who had once lived here, but he saw the way her hands hesitated before touching things that didn't yet feel hers. One morning, he rode to town for supplies. The risk weighed on him. He wondered if the traders might be waiting, if they would recognize his horse, if word had spread further than the gambling hall. Still, the cabin needed what it needed, and he couldn't expect her to live on scraps. He returned with cloth, thread, and a bundle of dried meat. When he laid the fabric on the table, she stared at it in disbelief. For the first time since he had known her, her lips parted in something close to a smile. She worked with it the very next day. Sitting near the fire, she cut and stitched with care, shaping the cloth into a dress that fit her body rather than the rags she had been left with. The neckline sat where she wanted it, the seams strong, the length covering her thighs, so she no longer felt exposed to eyes that sought to humiliate her. When she finished and slipped it on, she stood before him, waiting. Eli looked up from sharpening his knife, his eyes catching on the way the cloth hugged her figure, yet carried dignity. He gave a short nod. It was all he knew to give, but she saw in his face that it meant more. The cabin itself began to shift too. Eli repaired the broken boards in the second room, giving her space of her own, though she often chose to stay by the fire near him at night. She asked him once why he had built a cabin this size for a man alone. He didn't answer at first, then said quietly, "It wasn't meant to be just me." The grief in his tone explained more than any detail could. She didn't press further, only placed her hand lightly on his arm, letting him know she understood. Days stretched into weeks, routines formed. In the mornings, he cut wood while she hauled water. By midday, they shared bread and beans at the table, their movements growing more natural around each other. In the evenings, she sat near him, sewing or braiding her hair, while he worked leather or mended tools. Their words were few, but each glance, each small gesture, filled the silence with meaning. One evening, she returned from gathering herbs near the creek, her new dress dusted at the hem, her hair braided with feathers she had found. She stepped into the cabin carrying a handful of wild sage. Eli looked up from the table, and for the first time in years, he felt the space around him alive again. Not haunted, not empty, alive. She laid the sage by the stove, the smell sharp in the air, then turned toward him. Her eyes held his longer than before. He didn't look away. She walked closer, slow, steady, and placed her hand against his chest. "I stay," she said simply. Her voice did not tremble. It was not a question, not a plea. It was a decision. Eli's chest rose under her palm. He covered her hand with his own, his pale eyes softer than she had ever seen. No words followed. None were needed. The cabin was no longer a place of grief alone. It was theirs now, reshaped by survival, trust, and the choice to remain. That night, As the fire glowed and the cold pressed against the walls, she lay near him, her head resting against his shoulder. His arm wrapped carefully around her waist, holding without taking, steady without demand. For the first time, both of them slept deeply, without fear of chains or of waking to an empty bed. The life they were building had only just begun, but it was theirs, and it was real. The spring sun rose pale and steady over the hills, warming the frost-bitten ground into soft earth. Smoke lifted from the cabin's chimney, carrying the smell of beans simmering on the stove and fresh cut wood drying by the shed. The Apache woman stepped out into the yard barefoot. Her new dress fitted neatly to her body, the hem brushing just above her ankles, her hair braided with beads and feathers she had gathered from the creek bed. The bruises on her wrists had faded into faint marks, no longer chains but scars of memory. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady, no longer the same woman who had sat shivering in the trader's pen. Eli came from the corral, carrying a pail of water in one hand, his coat slung over the other. He looked at her standing in the yard and felt something shift in his chest. 4 or 5 years the cabin had been nothing but silence and labor, a place to survive the days and endure the nights. Now it held warmth again because she was there. He set the pail down and wiped his brow, his pale eyes resting on her longer than he meant to, but life on the edge of the cattle trail was never free of shadows. The traders who had ridden away weeks earlier had not forgotten. Rumors reached Eli in town when he had gone for supplies. Men muttering about the squaw he stole, talk of a plan to make an example of him. He kept that knowledge quiet, not wanting fear to return to her face. Yet he prepared. He cleaned his revolver more often, patched weak spots in the fence, and stacked extra wood by the door. The trouble came sooner than expected. Near dusk one evening, 3 riders appeared again at the ridge, but this time more followed. 5 men in all, rifles strapped across their backs. Their leader, the scarred man, shouted across the yard, "You can't keep her. She's worth money, and you paid nothing compared to what we'll get. Step aside, Mercer." Eli's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, revolver at his hip, shoulders squared. "She's not for sale. Not now, not ever." The woman stood in the doorway, her heart hammering, but this time she did not freeze. She remembered how she had once begged not to sleep alone in the cold, how fear had shaped her every word. But now she was in a home, under a roof, beside a man who had proven with silence and steadiness that he meant what he said. She would not let him face this alone. She stepped out, standing at his side. Her hand brushed his arm, steadying him as much as herself. The traders laughed at the sight. One raised his rifle, but before the scarred man could give the order, Eli drew. His revolver cracked loud against the empty hills, the shot sending dirt spitting near their leader's boot. His pale eyes fixed unblinking. "Next one doesn't miss," he said flatly. The riders shifted in their saddles, muttering, the weight of his stance cutting through their bravado. They had expected fear, maybe pleading, not a man willing to put his life down for a woman they still called property. And they hadn't expected her to stand beside him, unflinching, her dark eyes steady on them like flint. The scarred man cursed, spat into the dirt, then jerked his reins. One by one, the men turned their horses and rode off, the echo of hooves fading into the hills. When silence returned, Eli let his revolver drop to his side. He turned slowly toward her. Her breath was sharp, her body trembling, but her chin stayed lifted. He studied her for a moment, then asked quietly, "You sure this is what you want?" "Staying here, with me. It won't ever be easy." She stepped closer, placing her hand flat against his chest where his heart beat steady beneath his shirt. "I stay," she said firmly. "Not because I must, because I choose." The words struck him deep, undoing years of silence. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. This time when he kissed her, it was not hesitant. It was certain. Her hands rose to his shoulders, and for the first time, she leaned into him without fear. The cabin, once only wood and grief, had become a home again. She moved freely through it, sewing her dresses, cooking meals, tending the stove. He repaired the roof, rebuilt the corral, and began planting a small garden along the fence line. Their days were filled with work, their nights with firelight and quiet presence. No chains, no bargaining, no question of who belonged to whom. They both belonged to the life they chose to share. Why the first true warmth of spring, the cabin looked different. The wood was stacked neat, the fence stood straight. The second room carried her things, cloth, beads, feathers, jars of herbs she had gathered. Eli sat on the porch one evening, pale eyes soft as he watched her scatter grain for the hens, her dress catching the last light of the sun. She turned back to him, her smile small but real, and he knew with certainty that the years of silence had ended.